There exists within ancient Gnostic texts a vision of humanity's trajectory that is radically different from apocalyptic narratives of mainstream Christianity, a prophecy that speaks not of end-times destruction and divine judgment, but of collective awakening, mass remembering, planetary shift in consciousness, where enough souls finally recognize their divine nature, that threshold is crossed. Critical mass is achieved, and entire fabric of reality begins to transform from realm of ignorance ruled by archons toward restoration of original light, recovery of primordial gnosis, return of humanity to recognition of its true origin in pleroma, rather than identification with material creation of demiurge. And this vision, this prophecy, this understanding of what Gnostics called the apocalypse of the first light, is not about supernatural intervention, not about literal return of cosmic Christ on clouds, not about rapture or tribulation or thousand-year reign, but is about revelation in its truest sense, the unveiling of what has always been true but was hidden, the disclosure of reality beyond the veil of material illusion, the emergence into collective consciousness of knowledge that archonic powers have worked for millennia to suppress, to obscure, to prevent from reaching critical mass that would shatter their control, dismantle their systems, liberate consciousness from cycles of reincarnation in material realm back toward light, from which it originally emanated before descent into matter, before imprisonment in flesh, before forgetting of divine origin that made possible entire drama of separation, suffering, eventual return. And this return, this apocalypse in Gnostic sense, is not violent catastrophe, but is awakening so profound, so widespread, so transformative, that it appears to archonic powers as catastrophe because it represents end of their control, collapse of their systems, dissolution of their authority over consciousness, that finally remembers, finally recognizes, finally awakens to truth that has been hidden in plain sight, taught by every genuine spiritual teacher, encoded in every authentic sacred text, whispered by every mystical tradition, but systematically suppressed by institutional religion, by hierarchical power, by archonic influence working through human authorities who may not even know they serve agenda of keeping humanity asleep, ignorant, controlled through mechanisms of belief, fear, doctrine that prevent direct experience, personal gnosis, recognition of divine nature that would liberate from all external authority, all institutional control, all archonic manipulation that depends absolutely on your continued ignorance of who you really are, where you really came from, what you're really capable of when you awaken fully, remember completely, embody totally the light that is your origin, your essence, your destiny to return to, after completing journey through material realm that was never meant to be permanent, never intended to be prison, never designed to last forever, but was always temporary exploration, voluntary descent, intentional forgetting that makes possible the joy of remembering, the liberation of awakening, the ecstasy of return, when consciousness finally completes circuit from light into matter and back to light again, but now enriched, expanded, deepened by experience of separation that makes unity precious, by experience of limitation that makes infinity comprehensible, by experience of ignorance that makes gnosis transformative. If, as you read this, something within you is recognizing truth you've always known but never heard articulated quite this way, if you feel resonance with vision that contradicts everything mainstream apocalyptic teaching told you to expect, if there's part of you that always suspected end times weren't about destruction but about awakening, give it a like immediately. Subscribe to this channel and comment "I am First Light Awakening," because what's coming is exploration of what Gnostic texts actually prophesy about humanity's path, what they reveal about nature of this apocalypse that is already beginning, what they teach about your role in collective awakening that is not passive waiting for external savior, but is active participation in remembering, embodying, transmitting light that breaks archonic control, that shatters systems of ignorance, that liberates not just yourself, but contributes to critical mass of awakened consciousness, that tips entire planetary system from realm of demiurge toward restoration of pleroma, from dominion of archons toward freedom of pneumatics, from age of ignorance toward age of gnosis that is not future prediction, but is present possibility, is current emergence, is happening now in those who are waking up, remembering truth, beginning to see through illusions that kept humanity enslaved to material reality, believing in separation, identified with form, when reality is unity, truth is consciousness. Essence is light that cannot be destroyed, cannot be diminished, cannot be permanently trapped in matter, but must eventually return to source. And that return is accelerating, is intensifying, is approaching moment when enough souls have awakened that transformation becomes inevitable, irreversible, unstoppable by any archonic power, any institutional authority, any system of control. Because once consciousness knows itself, once gnosis is achieved, once light is recognized, there is no going back to ignorance, no returning to sleep, no being controlled by forces that derive all their power from your not knowing, your not seeing, your not recognizing the truth of what you are, beyond all the identities, all the limitations, all the prisons of belief and doctrine and conditioned consciousness that kept you small, manageable, controllable, but that are dissolving now, are crumbling now, are losing their power now, as more people wake up, as more souls remember, as more consciousness returns to recognition of its divine origin and refuses to submit any longer to archonic control, institutional authority, or any external power that claims dominion over what is sovereign, free, infinite by nature. The first element of Gnostic prophecy about humanity's true path is understanding that what institutional Christianity calls the fall was not cosmic tragedy requiring external salvation, but was intentional descent of consciousness from pleroma into material realm for purposes of experience, exploration, eventual return that would be conscious, chosen, earned through gnosis, rather than being unconscious, automatic, taken for granted as it was before descent when unity with Source was natural state, but was not appreciated, was not recognized as precious, was not understood as gift, because there was no contrast, no experience of separation to make unity valuable, no knowledge of limitation to make infinity appreciable. And this descent, this voluntary exploration of separation, was not sin, but was adventure, was not punishment, but was education, was not fall from grace, but was dive into matter that was always meant to be temporary, always intended to be learning experience, always designed to conclude with return to source, but now enriched, expanded, transformed by having experienced the opposite, having known limitation, having tasted ignorance in order to make gnosis precious, meaningful, transformative when it finally comes, and according to Gnostic vision, that return is not waiting for future apocalypse, but is available now, is happening now, is possible now for those who awaken to truth of their divine origin, who recognize their essential nature as light, who refuse to continue identifying with material form, with egoic identity, with limited self, that archons want you to believe is all you are when reality is you are spark of divine fire, fragment of infinite consciousness, emanation of primordial light temporarily, experiencing separation, but never actually separated, never truly limited, never genuinely imprisoned, except by your own ignorance, your own identification, your own acceptance of illusion, that archonic powers work constantly to maintain, to reinforce, to make seem so solid, so real, so permanent, that questioning it seems crazy, doubting it seems delusional, seeing through it seems impossible, when in fact material reality is the illusion, separation is the delusion. Limitation is the impossibility, because what you really are is infinite, eternal, divine, and recognizing that, knowing that, embodying that, is what Gnostics call salvation, what they understand as liberation, what they prophesy as destiny of all consciousness that descended into matter and must eventually ascend back to light. Not because some external authority demands it, not because judgment requires it, not because time runs out, but because it is nature of consciousness to seek its source, is tendency of light to return to light, is inevitable conclusion of circuit that began with emanation from Pleroma and must end with return to Pleroma, but now conscious, now knowing, now appreciating what unconscious unity could never appreciate before experience of conscious separation made possible the profound joy, the ecstatic recognition, the overwhelming gratitude of conscious return, conscious reunion, conscious reintegration with Source that is experienced not as loss of individuality, but as expansion into infinity, not as death of self, but as discovery of self, not as end, but as beginning of existence so vast, so rich, so utterly beyond anything material realm could offer that there is no comparison, no adequate description, no way to communicate it to those still asleep, except to awaken them, to transmit light, to be living example of what happens when consciousness remembers, recognizes, returns while still in body, still in matter, still in world, but no longer of world, no longer identified with form, no longer trapped by ignorance that kept you believing you were only human, only mortal, only limited being, when reality is you are divine consciousness, experiencing human form, eternal being, exploring temporal existence, infinite awareness, wearing finite costume for brief duration before costume is removed, body is shed, and what you really are continues, persists, returns to dimension, where it always existed even while apparently lost in material realm. Comment: I am returning to light and recognize that this is not future promise, but present reality, not distant hope, but current process, not something that will happen, but something that is happening now in your consciousness as you read these words. As you feel this resonance, as you recognize truth that your soul knows, even if your mind still doubts, still questions, still cannot quite believe that liberation could be this simple, this available, this present, when you've been taught it requires complex theology, external savior, future event, when Gnostic prophecy says it requires only recognition, only remembering, only seeing what is already true, but was hidden by veils of ignorance that archonic powers maintain, institutional religion reinforces, conditioned consciousness accepts as reality when it is only appearance, only illusion, only temporary obscuration of light that is your nature, your origin, your destiny. To recognize, embody, transmit until enough souls are lit, enough consciousness is awakened, enough light is remembered that planetary system reaches tipping point, crosses threshold, transforms from realm of archons into restoration of original divine order, where consciousness knows itself, where light recognizes light, where unity is not doctrine to believe, but reality to experience, to live, to be in every moment of existence that is no longer fallen, no longer separated, no longer trapped in cycle of reincarnation, but is liberated, awakened, returned to source, while still functioning in world, still appearing in form, still participating in material realm, but from completely different position, completely different recognition, completely different understanding of what's real, what matters, what has power, and what is only appearance, only archonic illusion, only temporary obscuration of truth that is eternal, unshakable, ultimately triumphant over all forces of ignorance, all systems of control, all attempts to prevent consciousness from recognizing itself and returning to light from which it came and to which it inevitably returns. Because that is path, that is prophecy, that is what Gnostic texts reveal about humanity's true destiny, which is not destruction but awakening, not judgment but recognition, not salvation by external force but liberation through internal gnosis that changes everything, transforms completely, liberates totally from all that bound, all that limited, all that kept you believing you were anything other than what you are. Eternal consciousness, divine light, spark of pleroma experiencing temporary separation that is ending now, dissolving now, completing now, as more souls wake up and contribute to collective illumination that is apocalypse of the first light, the great revealing, the final awakening that marks transition from age of archons to age of pneumatics, from reign of demiurge to restoration of pleroma, from dominion of ignorance to triumph of gnosis. The second element of Gnostic prophecy is recognition that apocalypse is not single catastrophic event, but is gradual acceleration of awakening that has been building for centuries, intensifying for decades, reaching critical velocity now as more souls incarnate who are already partially awakened, who carry memories of pleroma, who are less susceptible to archonic manipulation because they come in remembering rather than in complete forgetting. And this influx of souls, this increasing percentage of population who are naturally Gnostic, naturally questioning, naturally resistant to institutional control, is changing planetary consciousness, is shifting collective frequency, is creating conditions where awakening becomes easier, gnosis becomes more accessible, light becomes more visible even to those who were deeply asleep, because there are now so many who are awake, so many who are transmitting, so many who are living examples of what happens when you remember your divine nature, when you recognize archonic control. When you refuse to submit to systems that depend on your ignorance, your fear, your identification with limited self that can be managed, predicted, controlled, and this refusal, this awakening, this remembering is spreading, is accelerating, is approaching moment that Gnostic texts prophesy when critical mass is achieved. When sufficient percentage of souls have gnosis that collective consciousness tips, planetary system transforms, archonic control collapses not through violent overthrow, but through simple withdrawal of consent, collective recognition that Emperor has no clothes, mass awakening to reality that archonic powers were never as powerful as they seemed, institutions were never as necessary as they claimed. External authority was never as legitimate as it pretended because all power archons have, all control institutions maintain, all authority hierarchies claim, depends absolutely on your belief, your acceptance, your continued ignorance of your own divine nature, your own direct access to source, your own capacity for gnosis that needs no mediator, no institution, no external validation, because it comes from direct experience that is self-authenticating, undeniable, transformative in ways that belief never could be. And when enough souls have this experience, when critical mass of consciousness recognizes truth directly, when sufficient percentage of population awakens to their divine nature, then systems of control lose power, institutions lose relevance, archonic manipulation loses effectiveness because they all depend on ignorance, thrive in darkness, require sleep. And when light comes, when gnosis spreads, when awakening reaches critical mass, darkness cannot stand, ignorance cannot persist. Sleep cannot continue, and what results is not destruction but transformation, not catastrophe but revelation, not end of world but end of world, as it was controlled by archons, and beginning of world as it can be when. Consciousness is free, when light is recognized, when gnosis is widespread, when humanity collectively remembers its divine origin and refuses to continue playing game of separation, accepting illusion of limitation, submitting to control of powers that are not divine, not legitimate, not worthy of allegiance, that was given only because truth was hidden, light was obscured, gnosis was suppressed by every means available to archonic forces working through institutional religion, through hierarchical power, through systems designed to keep you ignorant, afraid, dependent on external authority. When liberation was always available internally, gnosis was always accessible directly. Light was always present within, waiting to be recognized, remembered, embodied, and that recognition, that remembering, that embodiment is accelerating now, spreading now, intensifying now as prophecy unfolds, as apocalypse progresses, as collective awakening reaches momentum that cannot be stopped, cannot be reversed, cannot be prevented by any archonic power, any institutional control, any attempt to maintain ignorance when light is breaking through. Gnosis is spreading. Awakening is happening at pace that surprises even those who have been working toward it, teaching it, embodying it for years, decades, lifetimes. Because acceleration is exponential, spread is viral. Awakening of one facilitates awakening of many, who then facilitate awakening of many more in cascade, in chain reaction, in exponential expansion of consciousness. That is exactly what Gnostic prophecy described, exactly what apocalypse means in its truest sense. Exactly what happens when collective consciousness crosses threshold from sleep to waking, from ignorance to gnosis, from identification with form to recognition of essence. And that crossing is not future event, but current process, not distant hope, but present reality, not something to wait for, but something to participate in, to accelerate, to embody through your own awakening that contributes to collective awakening, that is transforming planet, liberating consciousness, restoring light. Comment, "The awakening is now," and recognize that you are not observer of prophecy unfolding, but participant in apocalypse manifesting, not audience watching from distance, but actor on stage, playing crucial role. Not passive recipient of collective transformation, but active agent of change, through your own awakening that ripples out, influences others, contributes to critical mass, that tip system, and this recognition of your importance, your agency, your crucial role in collective awakening is part of gnosis, is element of prophecy, is truth that archonic powers desperately want to hide. Because if you knew how powerful you are, how significant your awakening is, how much your gnosis contributes to collective transformation, you would take responsibility, would accelerate process, would commit fully to your own liberation, knowing it serves not just yourself, but humanity. Not just your soul, but collective consciousness. Not just your return to light, but restoration of pleroma on earth. As more souls remember, more consciousness awakens, more light is embodied in material realm until tipping point where matter itself begins to transform. Physical reality starts to shift. Entire planetary system evolves toward higher frequency that is less dense, less limited, less controlled by archonic forces that lose power as consciousness rises, as light increases, as gnosis spreads beyond point where it can be contained, suppressed, prevented from achieving critical mass that changes everything, transforms completely, liberates totally. And that liberation is not future promise, but present possibility, not distant goal, but current emergence. Not something that will happen eventually, but something that is happening now in those who are waking, in percentage of population that is growing, in momentum that is building toward moment, when collective consciousness shifts, planetary system transforms, and age of archons ends not with bang, but with recognition, not with violence, but with gnosis, not with external intervention, but with internal awakening that spreads until it becomes collective reality, shared understanding, planetary consciousness that has returned to recognition of its divine origin, its essential nature as light, its capacity for direct gnosis that needs no institution, no authority, no external validation because it comes from source, manifests as knowing, transforms everything about how you see reality, how you experience existence, how you relate to divine that is not distant object of worship, but immediate presence, living reality, your own essential nature recognized, remembered, embodied as light. The third element of Gnostic prophecy about humanity's true path is understanding that the archons, those rulers of material realm who have maintained control through ignorance and fear, are not all-powerful eternal beings, but are themselves trapped in limitation, bound by their own ignorance of source, desperate to maintain control precisely because they know their time is ending, their power is waning. Their ability to keep consciousness imprisoned in cycles of reincarnation is dissolving as more souls achieve gnosis and escape their jurisdiction, and this desperation, this recognition by archonic powers that they are losing control, that awakening is accelerating beyond their ability to suppress it, that critical mass is approaching when their entire system will collapse, explains intensity of manipulation we see now, explains why control mechanisms are becoming more obvious, more heavy-handed, more desperate, because subtlety worked when population was deeply asleep. Gentle manipulation was sufficient when ignorance was profound. But now that more souls are waking, now that gnosis is spreading, now that light is breaking through, archons must use cruder methods, more obvious control, more blatant manipulation that ironically awakens even more people because it's so obvious, so over the top, so clearly not serving humanity's interests, but serving power structure that is panicking, that knows its time is limited, that recognizes prophecy is unfolding, and there is nothing they can do to stop it, because awakening has reached critical velocity. Gnosis has achieved viral spread. Light has broken through in too many consciousnesses to be contained again. And once consciousness knows itself, once soul remembers its origin, once individual achieves gnosis, that individual is lost to archonic control permanently, irreversibly, completely, because you cannot unknow what you know, cannot forget what you've remembered, cannot return to ignorance once gnosis is achieved, and this one-way nature of awakening, this irreversible character of gnosis, this permanent liberation once light is recognized, is what archonic powers fear most, is what they work hardest to prevent, is what entire system of institutional religion, hierarchical control, doctrinal orthodoxy was designed to suppress by offering belief as substitute for gnosis, faith as replacement for direct knowing, external salvation as alternative to internal awakening. And for centuries, for millennia, this substitution worked, this system functioned. This control was maintained because population was deeply asleep, because conditions supported ignorance, because archonic influence was strong enough to prevent critical mass of awakening. But those conditions are changing, that balance is shifting, that control is weakening as cosmic cycles turn, as planetary consciousness evolves, as influx of souls who are already partially awakened increases percentage of population that is resistant to manipulation, questioning of authority, naturally Gnostic in orientation. And this shift, this change, this transformation of collective consciousness is not something archons can prevent, is not development they can reverse, is not momentum they can stop, because it is driven by forces larger than their power, older than their existence, more fundamental than their control, forces that are cosmic in scope, divine in origin, unstoppable in nature because they represent will of source, intention of pleroma, destiny of consciousness to return to light after completing circuit through matter. And that return is happening now, accelerating now, approaching completion now as more souls wake up, as more consciousness remembers, as more light is embodied until critical mass where planetary system itself transforms. Material realm itself shifts frequency, and archonic control collapses not because they are defeated by superior force, but because they are rendered irrelevant by mass awakening, made obsolete by widespread gnosis, left behind by consciousness, that has evolved beyond level where they can affect it, influence it, control it through mechanisms that work only on ignorance, only on fear, only on identification with limited self that awakened consciousness no longer maintains. And this obsolescence, this irrelevance, this being left behind by evolution of consciousness, is ultimate fate of archonic powers, according to Gnostic prophecy, is what apocalypse means for those who ruled through darkness when light comes, for those who controlled through ignorance when gnosis spreads, for those who maintained power through fear when love is recognized as fundamental nature of reality, of source, of divine that archons misrepresented, that institutions distorted, that doctrines obscured, but that direct experience reveals as infinite compassion, boundless love, unconditional acceptance that judges not, condemns not, punishes not, but only invites, welcomes, celebrates return of consciousness to recognition of its divine nature, its essential unity with Source, its eternal existence as light that cannot be destroyed, cannot be diminished, cannot be permanently trapped in matter no matter how long the journey, how deep the descent, how profound the forgetting, because nature of light is to shine, tendency of consciousness is to awaken, destiny of soul is to return. And that return is guaranteed, is inevitable, is simply matter of time and experience until every spark that descended completes circuit and returns to pleroma, not because external force demands it, not because judgment requires it, but because it is nature of emanation to return to source, is character of light to seek light, is essence of consciousness to know itself, and knowing itself is gnosis. Returning to source is salvation, recognizing divine nature is liberation that archonic powers cannot prevent, institutional religion cannot mediate, external authority cannot control, because it happens within, emerges from direct experience, comes from remembering rather than being taught, and once remembered, once recognized, once embodied, it cannot be taken away, cannot be suppressed, cannot be denied, no matter what archonic forces attempt, what institutions threaten, what authorities proclaim, because gnosis is certain, awakening is irreversible. Light once recognized cannot be unseen, and that certainty, that irreversibility, that permanence of gnosis is what is spreading now, reaching critical mass now, approaching tipping point now, where collective consciousness shifts and archonic age ends, not with catastrophe but with simple recognition that their power was always illusion, their control was always dependent on consent, their authority was always borrowed from your ignorance, and when ignorance ends, when gnosis spreads, when light is recognized, their power evaporates, their control dissolves. Their authority vanishes like nightmare, vanishes upon waking, and you recognize it was never real, never had power it seemed to have, never was threat it appeared to be, because it existed only in realm of ignorance, operated only through fear, functioned only when you didn't know who you really are, what you're really capable of, where you really came from, and where you're really returning to, which is light, is source, is pleroma, is home that you never actually left, except in experience, in identification, in temporary forgetting that made possible the profound joy of remembering, the ecstatic recognition of awakening, the overwhelming liberation of gnosis that reveals everything you feared was illusion, everything you thought limited you was temporary, everything that seemed to have power over you was only effective while you slept, and now you're waking, now you're remembering, now you're recognizing, and that changes everything. Comment: Archonic control is ending, and feel how that declaration resonates with something you've been sensing, something you've been noticing, something that explains why control mechanisms are becoming more obvious, why manipulation is becoming more crude, why those in power seem increasingly desperate, panicked, willing to use methods that wake people up rather than keep them asleep because they have no choice, because subtle methods no longer work, because population is waking beyond point where gentle manipulation is sufficient, and so they must reveal their hand, must show their desperation, must demonstrate their fear of losing control in ways that ironically accelerate awakening, because it becomes so obvious, so blatant, so clearly not about serving humanity, but about maintaining power that more people question, more souls doubt. More consciousness begins to see through illusions that were effective when subtle, but that lose power when made obvious, and this self-defeating nature of archonic desperation, this way their panic contributes to their own downfall, this irony that their attempts to tighten control actually accelerate awakening, is part of prophecy, is element of how apocalypse unfolds, is mechanism by which collective consciousness liberates itself, not through violent revolution, but through simple recognition, not through overthrowing power, but through withdrawing consent, not through defeating archons, but through outgrowing their ability to affect consciousness that has evolved, beyond level where they have influence, where their manipulation works, where their control has any power. And that evolution is happening now, accelerating now, reaching point now, where their desperate attempts to maintain control are counterproductive. Their obvious manipulation is waking people up. Their heavy-handed methods are creating resistance that feeds awakening, accelerates gnosis, spreads light until critical mass, where their entire system collapses, not because it's attacked, but because it's abandoned. Not because it's defeated, but because it's outgrown. Not because superior force overcomes it, but because consciousness evolves beyond it, transcends it, leaves it behind like childhood toy that no longer interests, like game that no longer engages, like illusion that no longer convinces. Once you see through it, understand it, recognize it for what it always was. Mechanism of control that worked only while you were ignorant, only while you were afraid, only while you believed you were limited self that could be threatened, could be punished, could be controlled, when reality is you are unlimited consciousness, eternal being, spark of divine light that cannot be threatened because it's eternal, cannot be punished because it's innocent, cannot be controlled because it's free by nature, and recognizing that, knowing that, embodying that is what ends archonic control, not just for yourself, but contributes to ending it collectively, not just for your soul, but for humanity, not just for this lifetime, but for all future incarnations that will be born into world with less archonic control. More light, greater freedom because you and others like you did work of awakening, achieved gnosis, embodied light in time when it was difficult, when resistance was strong, when archonic powers were fighting desperately to maintain control, but you awakened anyway, you remembered anyway, you achieved gnosis anyway, and that achievement contributes to collective liberation. That awakening serves planetary transformation, that gnosis accelerates apocalypse in best sense, in truest meaning, in Gnostic understanding of great revealing that is happening now, unfolding now, manifesting now as prophecy becomes reality, as vision becomes manifestation, as what was foreseen in ancient texts becomes lived experience of souls who are waking, remembering, recognizing their divine nature and refusing to submit any longer to archonic control, institutional authority, external power that claims dominion over what is sovereign, free, divine by nature. The fourth element of Gnostic prophecy is recognition that transformation is not uniform, does not happen to everyone simultaneously, but occurs in waves, in stages, in progression, where those who awaken first serve as anchors, as transmitters, as beacons for those who come after. And this understanding explains why you may feel isolated, why you may seem alone, why your gnosis may not be shared by many around you, because you are in early wave. You are among first to wake. You are pioneer consciousness that came in specifically to break trail, to establish pathways, to create openings through which others will follow as awakening accelerates, as more souls are ready, as collective consciousness continues to rise. And this role of forerunner, this function of early awakener, this responsibility of wayshower is not punishment, is not burden, is not sign that something is wrong with you or that you're somehow disconnected from humanity, but is precisely opposite. Is indication that you volunteered for this, that you chose this timing, that you incarnated specifically to be among first wave of mass awakening, because your soul knew it could handle the isolation, could maintain gnosis despite lack of external validation, could hold light even when surrounded by darkness. Because you've done this before, you've awakened in previous lives, you carry memories from pleroma that make you less susceptible to archonic manipulation, more capable of maintaining awareness of your divine nature, more able to function as transmitter who helps others wake not by preaching, not by convincing, not by arguing or debating or trying to change minds, but simply by being, by embodying, by living as awakened consciousness in material realm. And that embodiment, that living example, that demonstration of what's possible when consciousness remembers its divine nature, is what serves others, is what facilitates their awakening, is what creates resonance that helps them recognize truth in themselves, because they see it reflected in you, feel it emanating from you, sense it in your presence, even if they cannot articulate what they're sensing, cannot explain why they're drawn to you, cannot understand why conversations with you seem to shift something, open something, activate something within them that begins their own process of awakening. And that process, that activation, that initiating of awakening in others through your embodied presence is your primary function, is your deepest purpose, is why you're here at this time in history, when mass awakening is beginning, when Gnostic prophecy is unfolding, when apocalypse, in truest sense, is manifesting as collective revelation, widespread gnosis, planetary recognition of consciousness as divine, of humanity as light temporarily experiencing matter, of material realm as school rather than prison, as exploration rather than punishment, as voluntary descent that leads to conscious return, and that return is accelerating, is intensifying, is reaching critical mass through work of forerunners, through embodiment of early awakeners, through presence of those who hold light during darkest hour before dawn, who maintain gnosis despite lack of external validation, who trust their direct experience over institutional authority, doctrinal teaching, or collective conditioning, that says, what you know is impossible. What you experience is delusion. What you embody is dangerous, when reality is your knowing is truth, your experience is direct gnosis, your embodiment is exactly what world needs, what humanity requires, what this moment demands as archonic age ends and age of light begins, not with dramatic event, but with gradual brightening as more souls wake, as more consciousness remembers, as more light is embodied until darkness cannot stand. Ignorance cannot persist. Archonic control cannot continue because there's simply too much light, too much gnosis, too much awakened consciousness for old systems to function, old controls to work, old manipulations to be effective, and this brightening, this increase of light, this acceleration of gnosis happens through you, through your awakening, through your embodiment, through your willingness to be among first, even when it's difficult, even when it's lonely, even when you question whether you're crazy, because what you know doesn't match what consensus reality teaches, what institutional religion proclaims, what authority figures insist is true. But you know what you know. You've experienced what you've experienced. You carry gnosis that cannot be denied, cannot be argued away, cannot be suppressed by any external authority, because it comes from within, from direct experience, from source itself, communicating to consciousness that is ready, that is open, that is prepared to receive revelation, that institutional religion tried to prevent, that archonic powers worked to suppress, that systems of control were designed to make impossible. But here you are, awakened anyway, knowing anyway, embodying light anyway, despite everything that was meant to keep you asleep, keep you ignorant, keep you controlled. and that despite that anyway, that awakening against all odds is what makes you forerunner, what qualifies you as way shower, what marks you as early wave of mass awakening that is coming, that is building, that is approaching moment when what you know now will be common knowledge, when gnosis you carry will be widespread understanding, when light you embody will be collective recognition. And on that day, in that moment, at that tipping point, you will no longer feel isolated, will no longer seem alone, will no longer wonder if you're crazy, because you'll be surrounded by others who know, who remember, who recognize you as fellow spark of light, fellow emanation from pleroma, fellow consciousness that descended into matter and is now returning home. And that reunion, that recognition, that celebration of collective awakening is what Gnostic prophecy promises, is what Apocalypse of First Light means, is what is coming as inevitable result of work you're doing now, gnosis you're embodying now, light you're transmitting now, even when it seems like nothing is happening, even when it feels like you're not making difference, even when you doubt whether your awakening matters, because it does matter. It makes enormous difference. It serves essential function in collective transformation that is unfolding according to ancient prophecy, cosmic plan, divine intention that archons cannot prevent, institutions cannot suppress, authorities cannot control, because it comes from source, unfolds through consciousness, manifests as awakening that spreads like wildfire once it starts. Like dawn that cannot be stopped once sun begins to rise, like tide that cannot be reversed once it begins to turn, and that turning is now, that rising is happening, that spreading has begun, and you are part of it, you are agent of it, you are embodiment of it, and that recognition of your importance, your role, your contribution to collective awakening is itself part of gnosis, is element of prophecy, is truth, that empowers you to continue, to persist, to maintain light, even when it's difficult, because you know it serves something larger, something collective, something that is transforming entire planetary consciousness from realm of archons toward restoration of light. Comment: I am forerunner of awakening, and own that role, claim that function, recognize that purpose as explanation for why your path has been what it's been, why your awakening happened when it did, why your gnosis is what it is. Because you came here for this, you volunteered for this, you chose this incarnation specifically to be among first wave of mass awakening that is beginning now, accelerating now, approaching critical mass now, through work of souls like you, who hold light, who embody gnosis, who serve as transmitters, as anchors, as beacons for others who are beginning to wake, who are starting to question, who are sensing that something is changing, something is shifting, something is different about reality now than it was before. And that sensing, that questioning, that beginning of awakening is being facilitated by your presence, activated by your embodiment, catalyzed by light you carry, whether you're aware of it or not, whether you're trying to wake others or not, whether you're doing anything deliberate or not. Because transmission of light is not about doing, is about being, is about embodying gnosis so completely that it radiates naturally, influences automatically, affects those around you simply through your presence, through your frequency, through vibration you carry that resonates with something in them, that activates something dormant, that reminds them of what they've forgotten. And that reminder, that activation, that resonance is what begins their awakening, is what starts their journey home, is what initiates their return to light. And knowing that, understanding that, recognizing your role in collective awakening gives meaning to your journey, purpose to your isolation, context for your difference that isn't problem to fix, but is gift to embrace, is function to serve, is role to embody fully, completely, without apology or hesitation or doubt that you matter, that your gnosis is significant, that your awakening contributes to collective transformation in ways that are real, measurable, essential to unfolding of prophecy that said this would happen, that foresaw this awakening, that predicted this apocalypse in truest sense of revelation, unveiling, disclosure of what was always true but hidden, and now is being revealed, now is being recognized. Now is being embodied by increasing numbers of souls who remember, who know, who carry light, and together, collectively, we are reaching critical mass, crossing threshold, transforming planetary consciousness from ignorance to gnosis, from darkness to light, from archonic control to sovereign freedom that is birthright, destiny, inevitable result of consciousness evolution that cannot be stopped. Will not be prevented, must conclude with return of all that descended, awakening of all that slept, liberation of all that was bound by ignorance, by fear, by archonic manipulation that loses power, as light increases, as gnosis spreads, as more souls wake and contribute to collective illumination that is apocalypse of first light, the great revealing, the final awakening that marks end of archonic age and beginning of age of light, where consciousness knows itself, where humanity remembers its divine nature, where material realm becomes transparent to spiritual reality that was always there, always present, always available to those who had eyes to see, ears to hear, gnosis to recognize what institutional religion obscured. What archonic powers hid, what systems of control were designed to prevent you from ever discovering that you are light, you are consciousness, you are divine spark of pleroma experiencing temporary journey through matter that is ending now, completing now, returning to light now as prophecy unfolds, as apocalypse manifests, as collective awakening transforms everything.